Assalamu alaikum and good evening to you all. Welcome to this third talk in the series of learning losses, challenges, and the way forward. These talks have been co-hosted by School of Education and Ideas. I am Dr. Tayyaba Tamim from the School of Education, and with me to co-host and to co-moderate this session, we have Dr. Rabea Malik, who is currently the CEO, and also she's a sociologist in education. We are very privileged today to have with us Dr. Michelle Kafenberger. Thank you so much for being here. Dr. Michelle Kafenberger is Deputy Director Research with the RISE program at the University of Oxford. Dr. Kaffenberger has done a lot of empirical research, which is focused on education systems and learning outcomes. She has also been a senior research advisor with the World Bank, where she has worked on financial inclusion, social protection, and international education. Dr. Kaffenberger has also served as a research advisor and consultant to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the United Nations, the Asian Development Bank, and a variety of private sector and non-profit organizations. A very warm welcome to you, Michelle, and thank you so much for taking out time with us. We will begin by inviting Michelle to give a talk for 25 to 30 minutes, and then we will open the floor for question answers. You're all welcome to put your questions in the chat box, and the floor is yours, Michelle. We are very excited listening. Over to you.
Well, thank you so much for that warm welcome, and thank you so much for the opportunity to come and join today. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be able to share some of the research that I and others at the RISE program have been a part of, and I just hope it's helpful in some way in all of the important work that you all do. So let me start by sharing my screen. Okay. And I will apologize up front. I have a bit of a sore throat. So if I sound a bit off or if I'm eating cough drops, that's why. It's just so I can get through without subjecting you all to my coughing or sore throat. But like I said, it's such a pleasure to be here today and to be able to talk about some of this work that's really focused on aligning education systems for learning. And so we're going to talk a little bit about learning trajectories and children's learning progression, learning losses that have come from the COVID crisis, but also from other school disruptions. And I just want to acknowledge up front, I know that the major flooding that Pakistan has been dealing with has had severe consequences for so many people, including children in their schooling. So I think this is really relevant in that context as well. And then finally talk about, how education systems might be able to come back stronger than they were before. So let's see. Yeah. So as a starting point, this is a well-known fact, but I just think it's worth acknowledging that school closures have affected essentially every child on the planet. So this is a collective problem right now. Kind of every country is in it together, trying to figure out the best way forward and to navigate how to best recover from the education part of the COVID-19 school closure crisis, as well as the health components of it. So as I think we all know, more than 1.6 billion children have been affected by school closures over the last 2 to 2.5 years. And we also have data that's begun emerging showing pretty substantial learning losses during those school closures. And so it varies, but across the board, almost all the data points to learning losses. In South Africa, we see big drops in learning. In Europe and Central Asia, students lost about a third of a year's worth of learning. Some work from part of our Pakistan team found that for some children, their learning actually regressed, meaning when they came back to school, they had forgotten actually some of the things that they had learned prior to the COVID school closures. So we have evidence that despite all of our best efforts to do any kind of remote learning, that children are indeed behind, and we need to take that seriously as they come back to school. And then finally, just to acknowledge, COVID is not the only source of schooling and education disruption. This is like I just mentioned, but we know that many children have been out of school as a result of the floods, and there's many other contexts as well that require school children to experience school closures. In the face of ongoing disruptions. And in order to do that, it's really important, I think, to understand the root causes of low learning and address those so that education systems and teachers and schools have the tools they need to adapt and recover when these crises emerge. So our agenda, the agenda I have for today is three main parts. The first is to understand current learning and current learning trajectory. So I'm going to talk a little bit about work that RISE has done on learning trajectories analysis, and I'll say what we mean by learning trajectories and a little bit on the findings there. And then talk about some of the potential long-term learning losses as a result of school closures, which underline the importance of taking these initial learning losses very seriously when children come back. And then finally end on a somewhat more positive note by talking about what we see and where the evidence is on how to align systems to improve learning and to build some of that resiliency in the face of recovering from school closures and crises. So with that as our agenda, I'm going to jump into the first one on learning trajectories. So first, a little bit of background on learning trajectories. So learning trajectories are an analytic tool for understanding education systems analysis. What they show are the dynamics of children's learning as they progress through school. So a lot of learning measures are at, say, one point in time, maybe at the end of primary school. What learning trajectories do is actually trace out children's learning as they go from one grade to the next. So you can start to see the dynamics of what they learn from one grade to the next. These also have the benefit of usually covering earlier grades, so we can understand when children begin to fall behind, and therefore when support and learning recovery is most needed. So altogether, researchers with the RISE program have analyzed learning trajectories for more than 50 countries, covering more than 6 million individuals, with that number growing as we continue to do analysis. And there's two kind of main broad sets of findings that we have from that body of work. The first kind of broad set of findings is that we find that learning trajectories vary quite widely across countries, but also are often quite flat and much flatter than expected. So these learning trajectories are drawing from a data set of more than 50 countries and showing literacy rates among young women based on how many years of schooling they completed. And at grade 6, a grade in which we would expect all children to have at least learned some basic literacy skills, you see wide variation. Literacy ranges everywhere from close to 0, from about 10% up to nearly 100%. But that also, on average, only 50% of women who have completed primary school have retained basic functional literacy. So learning trajectories are also far flatter than what we would want them to be. And then to underline those findings is that these findings are also quite consistent, looking across even different data sources. So we find similar findings from different data using a different literacy assessment. If we look at that completed primary school level, we again see that very wide variation in literacy levels. And also on average, about half have achieved literacy. And Pakistan is right about in the middle there, tracking again about the average rate of literacy across that, across those years of schooling. The other kind of broader set of findings that we have coming out of learning trajectories is that we see that achieving, in most contexts, goals of equality, say across groups, will often not achieve goals of universal learning. And that's because even the better off groups are often not really learning that much, and certainly not reaching some of the foundational learning goals that we would like for them. So this is based on some simulations looking at what would happen if across those same 10 countries from the previous slide, so Pakistan is part of this, if we were to achieve equality across genders, So if girls had the same schooling and or the same learning outcomes as boys, what would that do for girls' educational outcomes? And what we see is that that kind of equality would have a positive impact for girls. It would increase literacy by 8 percentage points, but it would still leave 30% functionally illiterate. So equality is good, but universal is better. And what it really underlines is the need to ensure that all children are achieving and being provided a high quality education. We don't want to leave those 30% of boys and girls functionally illiterate. We want to make sure the whole system is achieving strong learning outcomes for all of its students. So just in sum on that kind of first part on learning trajectories. So we find that learning trajectories vary widely and often are flat. That more years of schooling alone will not resolve the learning crisis because those learning trajectories are just too flat. If they continue at that pace, it's not steep enough to get to those learning goals that we have for children. Equality across groups will often leave many without basic skills. In most places, the education system really needs to improve learning for nearly all students and all children. And then finally, that steepening learning per year, which is what we'll talk about in the rest of the presentation, particularly starting in the early grades, was critical even before COVID-19 related school closures or other disruptions. So these learning trajectories obviously draw on data that was collected pre-COVID. So to say, you know, a lot of the problems with children being behind expectations and behind the curriculum level now, those challenges were already in place before the school closures. And so the set of tools that we have to address it are the set of tools we need to address the learning losses from closures are going to look a lot like the kinds of tools that we wanted to put in place anyway. So that's what creates an opportunity for a system to come back stronger than before. So using this data on the learning trajectories, what we then did was able to look at potential long-term implications of school closures and the learning losses that children experienced during those school closures. And we ran some simulations about the possible implications of school closures, knowing the level of learning that children have missed out on. And so the first point is that we should expect children to be behind when they return to school following a disruption. We see across the board, and I think this is really important to recognize, the world did a lot of, a lot of countries did a lot of things to try to do remote learning, and really across the board, even in the best of circumstances, children did not learn as much. They really learn best in person. We have a lot of evidence now, remote learning support can support in some ways, but really being in schools is what's best. And so we should expect children to be behind if they've been out of school for an extended period of time. This one I'm going to skip. It's less important. It's just kind of highlighting what it looks like on a learning trajectory if children are behind when they return. But the thing that I'd like to underline is that it's not just immediate learning loss that we should be worried about, but the possibility of continued or accumulating learning loss even after children return to school that we should be mindful of as we think about how to help with learning recovery. And so why the concern for long-term losses? Well, it's because we have some evidence that that these short-term losses can continue to accumulate even after children return to school. This is evidence, I'm sure many of you are probably familiar with this, but a study that came out following many years following the Pakistan earthquake in 2005, where the researchers went back 4 years later and were able to compare similar groups of children who had been affected and not affected. And what they found was that 14 weeks of missed school due to the earthquake had resulted in 2 years of lost learning just 4 years later. And so those learning losses had grown. And so that caused them to investigate, why would this be? Why would these learning losses have continued to increase even after children returned? And one of their best hypotheses is that that children return to school behind the curriculum and behind the level of instruction. Teachers had not been supported or trained to adapt their instruction accordingly, or had not been given the flexibility to adapt accordingly. They picked up the curriculum where they expected the children to be, and children couldn't engage in that curriculum. And so their learning continued to be flat. So they might have been in school, but they weren't able to actively engage in the level of instruction that was being taught to them. So despite being in school, they actually continued to accumulate learning losses. So we took that evidence and we took our learning trajectories data and we ran simulations and said, what might similar outcomes be in the face of COVID learning losses? And so we modeled possible long-term learning losses due to the school closures from COVID. And we have similar results in terms of the possibility of accumulating losses. And so what we found when we did these simulations was that for today's third graders, missing half a year's worth of learning due to the COVID losses, which given recent evidence is a very reasonable amount that we might expect children to have missed out on during those school closures. That has the possibility to reduce their long-term learning outcomes by as much as a year and a half's worth of learning by the time those students are in grade 10. And so what's the mechanism there? It's the same mechanism that the researchers hypothesized in the face of the earthquake. It's that because children re-enter the school behind the curriculum, they continue to fall further and further behind without adequate remediation to help them catch up. We then ran the same simulation for first graders and said, okay, how would that maybe look different for the younger cohort? And sure enough, what we find is that today's first graders, missing, again, the same amount, half a year's worth of learning, could reduce their long-term learning outcomes by as much as 2.5 years. And so this suggests that the youngest school children stand to lose the most without adequate recovery. And part of the reason there is because those students are missing out on these core foundations that are the building blocks for later learning. And because they have more years remaining in school across which those losses can continue to accumulate. So just to underline kind of how can that be, how do we anticipate that maybe relatively short learning losses could continue to accumulate? Well, like I said before, but it's just kind of an illustration for it, is that if you can picture, say, a first grader who has been out of school and missed out on basic, say, 2-digit addition and did not learn that while they were out of school, and they come back into school, maybe halfway through first grade, or maybe they come back in second grade if it was a long closure, and the teacher picks up the curriculum and the curriculum says, let's teach basic multiplication, and they teach basic multiplication. Those students don't have the building blocks necessary to engage in that instruction. They can't understand multiplication because they don't have the addition mastery in order to engage fully. And so they're in school, but they're not learning those new skills. So their learning losses are continuing to accumulate. And that's what we're quite worried about. So this is the place where we want to support teachers to help make sure those children have those building blocks so that they don't continue to be left behind. So now onto the more positive part of the message, but how might we mitigate some of these losses when children return to school? So if we know that this is going to be a challenge and we know we have to face it, what's some of the evidence on how some of these losses might be mitigated? So at the RISE program, we've pulled together a set of principles drawing on kind of a broader evidence base that we call the ALIGNS principles. And these are a set of 4 principles for aligning instruction and aligning systems with each other and with what children need in order to effectively learn. And the 4 principles are first, to set clear learning goals, prioritizing catch up on foundational skills. So these foundational skills goes to that point about making sure children have the building blocks to engage in later learning. If they've missed foundations, or if they don't have foundations, maybe they never learned them in the first place if they're in a higher grade, we need to prioritize those so they can engage in instruction. We need to adapt instruction to children's learning levels, including assessing learning when they return. We need to support teachers and other instructors to implement these different things. These are non-trivial things that we're asking teachers and instructors to do in their classroom. They're going to need support to do that. And then any particular approach will need to be adapted to the opportunities and constraints in the context. There's no silver bullet solution. There's no one size fits all solution that can just go everywhere. It will always need to be adapted. And so that's why we talk a lot about the principles. It's not just an approach that should be done, but how can these principles be applied within the constraints and opportunities that are in a particular context. And so I'm going to unpack each of those in just a little bit more depth. So first, to set learning goals with a focus on foundational skills. So why the focus on foundations? Well, it's because we do have a lot of evidence that children who miss foundational skills early on rarely catch up later. And so without foundations, that learning flattens. Like I said, they're not able to engage in the new instruction. Many children who miss foundational skills in the early grades never gain them later. This graph is showing children who are in, I know it's a bit difficult to read, but I'll just tell you so you don't have to read all the little writings. But there's children in grade 6th and 7th and 8th grade that have remained at a grade 2 and 3 learning level. That's what the orange arrows are pointing at. Those are children in higher grades that have remained at those lower learning levels, and they haven't achieved those foundations. So they've stayed in school, but they're not able to engage in instruction. And so, I'm worried that young children missing foundational skills may have the largest negative long-term consequences for learning of school disruptions. And so that's a big area for focus and I think prioritization. And so setting universal foundational skills as a top priority, this suggests that political and education leaders should clearly prioritize all children achieving foundational literacy and numeracy, and with that articulate clear and achievable goals to reinforce that commitment. And then with those goals in place, the idea is that those would then enable other parts of the system to align around those goals. So the curriculum is going to need to be adapted to align, at least the way the curriculum is implemented will need to be adapted to align around those learning goals, the training and support to teachers, assessments, and more. For the second area, so assessing children's learning levels when schools reopen. Just like we've said, children will be behind when they return to school, but by unknown and varying amounts, right? It is going to vary a lot by student. It's going to vary a lot exactly how much learning they gained or missed while they were out of school. And so it's going to be really important for teachers to have an understanding of children's learning levels when they return to school and have an understanding of the learning levels of the children within their classroom. And so quick, simple, formative assessments that can be used by teachers in the classroom to get a sense of their children's learning, their students' learning levels are a really important part of that. These assessments are not meant for accountability. They're not meant to be high stakes. They're meant to be very simple, very low stakes, and to be used as a tool by the teachers. And so there's some examples. The illustration here is one example drawing on Pratam's Oscar assessment tool. There's a relatively new international common assessment of numeracy tool. It goes by ICANN. That's an open source, publicly available assessment tool that's also quite simple and easy to implement quickly. There's early grade reading assessments and mathematics assessments. All of these are open source and available for use, and there's other types of tools out there as well. So using tools like that and getting them into the classroom for teachers to use so they can understand those children's learning levels. And I'll mostly skip this, but just to say also, or the other way to do it is to use assessments that are already within the system. And so third graders could be given the grade 2 end of year assessment to get a sense of if they're starting third grade, what from the grade 2 curriculum did they not gain, and what did they learn and what did they not learn, so that third grade teacher can start with catch up on the parts that they missed. If a national assessment was implemented kind of immediately or recently prior to a school disruption, it could be re-administered to see how much of that knowledge children have maybe lost or regressed in the time during the disruption. So there's also a lot of tools that already exist within the system that can simply be adapted. And just to underline that all of these options require supporting and equipping and enabling teachers to either use new types of assessments or to use existing assessments for alternative purposes. Again, it's a lot to ask of teachers, so we need to make sure that they're being supported to do that. And then finally, support teachers to adapt instruction to meet children where they are. So to use those assessment results and that understanding of the learning levels that children are at, to implement remedial instruction and adapt that instruction to where they are. So there's a handful of approaches that have really risen up in the evidence space as ones that seem to work quite well and work in a lot of different contexts. And I won't read them here because I'm going to touch on each of them just briefly on a slide each. So the first is to streamline curriculum and dedicate time for catch-up. And so this is, involves taking a look at that existing curriculum, and almost all curriculums have, the full breadth of material that should be covered, but some material is, of course, higher priority and more critical than others for future learning. And so it's a matter of looking at the curriculum and saying what could be removed in order to carve out the time and the space necessary for catch up on missed learning and for ensuring that mastery of those foundational skills. So streamlining curriculum, this is a pretty common approach in the kind of education and crisis context, and one that a lot of countries have taken as a COVID recovery approach, so that dedicated time is there for catch-up. Another common approach is teaching at the right level. This involves assessing and then grouping children by their learning levels, so they can be taught right at their level with the goal of quickly moving them up to the higher groups. It's temporary. It's just to get them caught up until everyone's at the same level and at grade level, and then they go back to their normal instruction. And there's tools available at that website there on this. Another approach are structured pedagogy approaches, which involve providing structured materials that are well aligned with each other to teachers, they often involve coaching for teachers, aligned assessments that provide a package for how teachers might implement this on the ground. And there's also a lot of materials and how-to guides available for those. And then finally, what I already talked about, but to say, RISE has this set of alliance principles that we discuss in more depth that talks through different approaches that have all, the things they have in common is a set of principles for aligning instruction with children's learning levels to help them catch up and stay up. So just to close out, how much of a difference do we think these different mitigation measures could make for children's learning? And so we took these remediation approaches and we ran the same simulations that I showed before, but assuming some level of remediation. And so what we find is that effective remediation when children first return to school can reduce those long-term learning losses. It can help children catch up. It doesn't completely make up for the school closures, but it can go some ways to making up for the school closures. But the really exciting scenario is that when we run these and say, what happens if teachers keep these good practices in place long-term? So if they incorporate this at adapting instruction to children's learning levels, using assessments on a regular basis, meeting children where they are, not leaving children behind like we saw in the learning trajectories when children fall behind the level of instruction. If they keep those good practices in place long-term, what can we see? And that's when we see the possibility for an education system to actually come back stronger than before and achieve greater learning than if the COVID school closures had not happened. And I think this is the kind of exciting scenario too, in the sense of if we think of this as an opportunity to kind of train and support teachers with some of these tools and with some of these approaches that they can use in the face of other disruptions. Now we've empowered them, we've capacitated them, and they're able to help navigate students through future disruptions as well. We don't have to start from scratch with a whole new training program. We want to give them the tools that they can use in the face of school disruptions, whether it's COVID or whether it's other scenarios as well, to keep those good practices in place to make sure children don't fall behind and make sure all children are mastering those foundations so they can engage in later learning. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for this very insightful presentation. Rabea, shall I go to you for the first question, or shall I go ahead?
Please do, Tayyaba, I'll follow you.
Michelle, I was just wondering, there were some very thought-provoking questions sort of that were out there, not questions, but statements. I was wondering, what do you mean by equality across groups will leave many without basic skills? So if you could explain this a little bit more, please.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, so this is one of the pretty big findings from our learning trajectories work, and it's pretty consistent across countries as well, that within a country, achieving equality of schooling or achieving equality of learning outcomes, learning per year across groups. So I showed one that was across genders. So if girls had the same schooling or learning as boys, we've done similar analysis across income levels. So if the bottom, say 20 or 40% had the same schooling or learning as the top 20%, if achieving that kind of equality across groups can achieve some improvements in learning outcomes, but it would still leave many without skills because what we find is even those advantaged groups are often having poor learning outcomes. So there's a big focus right now on girls' education, and rightfully so. Like, every girl deserves and should have a high quality education. But if that aim becomes, let's just achieve equality with boys, well, there's a lot of boys that are getting a poor education. There's a lot of boys that are dropping out of school. There's a lot of boys that aren't learning to read by grade 3 as well. And so if it's almost kind of bringing the goal down to too low of a level, what we should actually want is for all of the children to stay in school and to learn to read. And so so that's what we mean by that. Even if girls had the exact same schooling and learning as boys, if we achieve that kind of equality, our data shows that on average about 30% of them would still be functionally illiterate, because among boys 30% are functionally illiterate. And so what that suggests is that it's not so much a gender, it's a bit of a gender problem, of course, but it's not all a gendered problem. It's actually an education problem, and we need to improve the systems that are providing that education to ensure that all of those children are getting a higher quality education as well.
Thank you, Michelle. Rabea ji.
Thank you. So, Michelle, one of the things that really stands out from listening to you talk about the learning trajectories is 2 or 3 things. One, how important it is to address gaps in learning data. So while a lot of developing countries, including Pakistan, have made progress over the past few years in improving the data that comes out of schools, I think the learning data is this final challenge, sort of getting it right and making sure it's being collected at regular intervals at all levels of, so that really stands out. But the other point that's so important, I think, is this interconnection with other policy domains that I think the Alliance principles sort of cover, which is to say that if you want to make sure that teaching and learning is happening in a particular way in class, you're going to have to thin out your curriculum a bit. And that understanding needs to happen at various policy levels. Similarly, the investments in teacher support and making them realize that they have the autonomy to respond to the needs of the children without worrying about sort of the constraints of so these are really big, perhaps long-term goals. Do you, so one example, sorry, it's a little bit of an explanation, but one example that comes to mind is how education financing worked. There was a lot of investment done over a number of years at various levels of government to drive home the point that budgets needed to be linked to targets. And now you're seeing that actually that practice has become part of the daily practice of many education systems. Do you, what kind of engagement do you anticipate with education, with governments and education departments, so that a lot of these insights almost become, you know, sort of second nature to how they do their work? I'll stop.
Yeah, it's a great set of questions, right? So I think, one thing I would say is that it takes that, I do think it takes some commitment and that dedication to improving learning at all levels of the system. So that's actually why the first principle in the Alliance principles is kind of this commit to learning goals. So getting those goals embedded, because you need to have that kind of common objective to then start talking about the other pieces, right? So once you have agreement that you have a common objective, and say the objective could be, let's ensure all children, in a COVID context, let's ensure all children catch up on learning they missed. But I think much more broadly, like, let's aim a little bit higher. Let's make sure every child has the foundations they need by the end of grade 3, right? So the first one is to decide on that goal and to set it and to get that commitment at the levels of the system. And then you have a common objective that you can talk about the other things. Okay, how are we going to achieve that goal? Okay, in order to achieve that goal, we need to collect data so we know how we're doing on it. Okay, how can we collect that data? Well, it should be low stakes, because we know there's all sorts of problems with high stakes. It just promotes, poor incentives and things like that. Let's make sure it's a low stakes assessment. No one's job is on the line if children perform poorly. We just really need to know where children are. What else do we need to do to achieve that goal? Well, we need to look at the curriculum. Is the curriculum supportive of that goal? We know teachers feel a lot of pressure to complete the curriculum. And so if they feel that they must complete the curriculum and the curriculum is not aligned with the goals, we've put teachers in a very difficult place, right? And so that's where I try to talk about it a lot in terms of, this idea of an overambitious curriculum is often thought of as kind of aspirational, which is fine. Like, we should have really high aspirations, but it's also some quite unfair to teachers to have these expectations on their shoulders that really aren't appropriate for the kind of teaching that they need to do. So how can we think about streamlining that curriculum so that we're being a bit more fair to teachers and allowing them to meet those objectives and goals? So the goals, then with the goal, you can have the data that's needed to understand it. You can start talking about things like curriculum, because things like changing curriculum is a very, it's a very political process. There's a lot tied up there. And so maybe the last thing, and then I'll pause, and also a lot can be done within the confines of what already exists. So maybe there isn't enough political will for a major reform of the curriculum. That's fine. Those are very infrequent, right? Like, and it would be a very political process, and it might be difficult to get through anyway. But within the curriculum, what adaptations can be made to make sure the right things are being prioritized, and maybe just a little less time is given to some of the topics that are less important. Maybe they're still covered, but and teachers are being supported to navigate that and to know where they should prioritize and put their emphasis and things like that. So I do think there's space for kind of adapting within the current constraints. There's kind of the short term, like adapt within, and then a long-term goal of maybe reorienting those bigger systems around a common set of goals as well.
Thank you, Michelle. I was just wondering, we have been constantly talking about, this time thing, this being a temporary phase in which we do some sort of remedial teaching, sort of to bump up where the learning level of the students, and then they return. There are two questions actually. First, I was just wondering if some work has been done regarding the estimation of time that would need to dedicate to this remedial teaching. The second question is, what do you see as the biggest challenge over here? Because we're thinking about the curriculum, we're looking at the teachers, and then we are thinking of teachers in a different role. So somehow we are looking at teachers as enablers, and they are actually making decisions in their class. I'm just saying, they do make decisions, but somehow in the bureaucracy, in the hierarchy under which they work, they have very little agency to do that. Over to you. Michelle, you're on mute.
Sorry, I was muted there. sorry, I got hung up on your second one because I was thinking about the teachers and their decision, but remind me of the first.
The time thing. So I mean,
Oh, the time. Yes, yes, thanks. No, I got it. I just got that. Um, yeah, um the time varies, of course, and I think that's what countries are experimenting with right now. So I won't pretend to have like a clear answer that it should just be this and then it's all been sorted. Um, but I can, I'll give my sense from what I see different countries doing. And so, for a COVID school closure that lasted maybe a full year, year and a half, that's going to take substantial time to catch up on, right? And so, you know, I would love to see maybe, and again, I know this is kind of reaching, but maybe the first 3 months back are dedicated to catching up on all the material that they missed. And that's where the streamlining comes in, right? You can't cover a year and a half's worth of material in 3 months, but if you pick out the parts that are most important, especially for the building blocks, the parts that they're going to need for later learning, like which parts are they going to need in order to engage in the new curriculum, the new grade, um, and just really focus on that. Now, most education systems won't provide, months of dedicated time to old material and not cover any of the new material. So the other thing we see being common is either extending the school year into some of the holiday months or times to do catch up, or having after school catch up classes and things like that. If it's an after school catch up, it's going to need to last even longer, right? Because it's maybe only an hour or two per day versus a full school day that's been missed out on. So again, I'm not saying I have it's not, this is all being experimented right now. But my suggestion would be it might take a full year of after school classes to catch up on what was missed, just given the quantity of what was missed and how little can be covered in an hour a day. You're just going to need a lot of those hour a days to cover the necessary material, especially if children are still learning the current material during the school day. It's a lot for them to kind of be able to retain at once. So I would say that would be kind of the spectrum of anywhere from a couple months of dedicated time to maybe a full school year's worth of after class dedicated kind of remediation or catch up classes, in order to be able to cover, especially, and again, it's a prioritization of those most important building blocks that were there. In terms of teacher autonomy in the classroom and decision making, this is one of the really tough spots, right? And this is why at Rise we talk a lot about education systems and the need for systems reform, because I don't think it's fair or really realistic to put it on the shoulders of teachers. They only have so much room for changing things, right? So we can't just say teachers should teach differently, go do it. They need the things that they're accountable for to change too. If they're accountable for completing the syllabus, we can train them to do other things all day long. But if at the end of the day, they're going to be told you didn't complete the syllabus, you haven't done your job right, then all that training is for naught. So that is where it gets tricky. That is where it requires, I think, the ongoing relationship with the right players in the country, in the government, whether it's at the district level or regional level or national level, to be working on how to get some of these expectations changed or adapted. And I think that's one of the things that there seems to be an opening following COVID that wasn't there before. So before, if you go and say, we need to change expectations of teachers, it's not fair to them, completing the syllabus shouldn't be the only goal, like they should be able to focus on whether children are learning, and say, well, that's just too hard, we can't do that. 2 years of COVID school closures and everyone realizes something has to change has created an opening in a lot of places where these things can be suggested that maybe weren't possible before. So to say maybe the curriculum should be adjusted or maybe just temporarily adapted. Can we adapt it just for 1 year and change the expectations on teachers? And then maybe if it goes really well, some of those changes can stay in place. And if not, at least it's been a full year where teachers, where maybe the instruction has been better aligned to students' learning levels and some lessons can be learned from that experience. So I do think there is this tension between a lot of what needs to happen is with teachers and in the classroom, but a lot of what what's decided for them happens outside the classroom. So marrying up those two places and trying to adjust what the expectations of teachers are is really, it's really tricky, but I agree. And I think that's where a lot of the kind of hard work has to be done.
So Michelle, there are a couple of questions in the chat box also, and two of them, one by Mavish Safar and the other one by Hania Masood, are actually focusing on the same thing. They are thinking about teachers, and they're saying, so teacher, this also requires some sort of teacher training. So how do we cut down on that time? And also, how do we, I mean, thinking of it, these teachers are also affectees of the same COVID. These are also affectees of the same floods. So they might also be going through, something at home. So how do you, I mean, over to you, how do we sort of like tackle this? Do we think of more recruitments? How do we sort of think about it?
Yeah. I mean, you guys are full of really good questions that I wish I had more clear answers to, but these are obviously the things that are being actively worked on. So, I'll share what I can from the places that I see trying different things. One thing that comes out really clearly in terms of teacher training and support, and I keep saying support because I think training has a certain idea where teachers come and they sit and they're trained and then they go back. I try to say support because it suggests more of like an ongoing engagement with the teachers. And so one of the things that we see that seems quite critical for some of the programs that achieve the good foundational learning is that there's some kind of coaching component for teachers. And so that looks different depending on context, but it might be, and the places that are most successful with this are ones that are able to find that there's someone already in the system for whom this is sort of already in their job description. It might be done very differently, but if it's at least there, you can change, you can kind of pull them into that. And so in some places, it's someone that sits at the district level who maybe has a curriculum support role, and you can train those people to be providing some coaching to teachers. So you train that person in, say, a structured pedagogy approach and say, this is how the materials work. This is how teachers should walk through the materials. This is how they should use the assessments. This is how you use assessments in low stakes environment for quick turnaround. And this is how you take the assessment results and use them to inform your instruction. Those are difficult tasks. And so train that person who's, say, at that maybe district level. I hesitate to say, but in some places it's been maybe an inspector role because they already go to schools on a somewhat regular basis. If it's an inspector role, you really have to change their job description because a coaching role is much different from an accountability role. But if that can be done because it's already in their behaviors to go visit schools, if you can change what they're doing to, instead of just inspecting schools, to actually sit in classrooms and give pedagogical feedback, that's a way to do it too. Again, because then it's not a huge new cost, right? You already have someone who's visiting schools, just change a little bit what they're doing while they're at the schools and train them on how should teachers be implementing these assessments? How should they be using the materials? Are they doing it well? And then maybe the one last thought on that too is that there has also been some powerful effects of creating kind of teacher peer learning groups. So once teachers have some experience implementing these, to create, maybe weekly or every 2 weeks or once a month, the grade level teachers have a peer learning group where they bring their struggles, they bring their challenges to the other teachers. They hear how other teachers have dealt with it. And that's a way for them to get ongoing support. Again, without a huge new cost, you're not having to create new positions, but maybe there's some facilitation that the head teacher does to enable those conversations. And so to allow that as kind of the ongoing. But I think the key part in all of those is I maybe just named like 3 different ways that it could be done, but is that it's kind of this ongoing support relationship that is able to kind of continue so that as teachers experience challenges, they can get the support and ask the questions that they need in order to be able to continue to do it.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Rabea, any questions from your side?
No, thank you. I was going to ask for examples, so this was fantastic. Thank you.
So, Michelle, I have two questions, again, very similar one. One is from Dr. Gulab Khan, and he wants you to sort of define learning and learning loss a little bit more with reference to mathematics. And there is another question by Mehwish Zafar, and she says, would you please also explain what the flatness of learning trajectory means? What does it actually reflect? So over to you.
Yeah, great. Thanks for those questions. Yeah, in terms of defining learning and learning loss, and specifically in the context of school closures or some kind of disruption where children have missed out on school, there's two main components to learning loss that we see. The first component is learning that children would have gained if they were in school that they're not gaining because they're not in school. So maybe if they had been in school for that month, they would have learned something. They're at home, they haven't learned it. So that's the first area of learning loss, is they would have learned something, and because they're not there, they haven't learned it. They've lost out on that opportunity to learn that material. The second component of learning loss is this that I touched on, actual regression of learning, which means they actually move backwards in their learning journey. So, and we see this especially, the longer the school closure is, and I think the younger the student is, the more likely this becomes. And so this would be students who had actually learned certain material, and then they're out of school and they forget some of what they've learned. And so I know the question was specific to mathematics, so that could look like, I think the first one is just relatively straightforward for any subject, if they've missed out on learning. But the regression, if children have regressed in their ability to do math, maybe they had learned some basic addition and subtraction, they're out of school too long, they forget some of that, they come back, they struggle to be able to do that. And we actually see this is a common phenomenon called summer learning loss. Well, at least in the West, it's called summer learning loss because it's over the summer that children are out of school for 3 months. But school, the school's out loss, like the typical school closure in a typical school year, it is common for children to regress. So it's not surprising that we see this in the face of a disruption or a school closure scenario where students in a non-crisis situation, even in just a normal school year, will finish the school year, they'll be out of school for a couple of months, they'll come back, they'll be a little bit behind where they were when they left school. They've just lost some of that learning. And so there's already built into a typical school year the need for some of that catch up, and then any kind of crisis scenario just exacerbates that because more is being lost. So that's a really critical area, I think, first to recognize that the children might actually come back behind where they were when they left, which just underlines that need for catch up even more than just the catching up on the material that they didn't learn while schools were closed. And then on the flatness of the learning trajectories, what it's showing is the learning trajectory is showing how much learning children have gained as they go from one grade to the next. So the steepness of it, the steeper it is, the more they learn from one grade to the next. The flatter it is, the less they learn from one grade to the next. And then regression would actually be a downward sloping, where they've actually lost learning as they go from one grade to the next. And so the kind of flatness, or at least just not very steepness, the shallowness, if you will, that we see in a lot of learning trajectories, what that's showing is that is children not gaining a whole lot of new learning as they go from one grade to the next. So they're progressing through grades. So they're moving from grade 1 to 2. They're moving from grade 2 to 3, but they haven't mastered all of the material that was intended for those grades. And then this gets at one of the points that's been raised elsewhere too. And then what happens is, because they haven't learned that material, they're not able to engage in the new instruction. So their learning trajectory stays flat. So they're in school, but they're not learning because they're not able to actively engage in that instruction. They might be zoned out, they might be looking at the ceiling, they might be drawing pictures, but they're not learning. but not because it's their fault. I think this is the really important part. It's not because they're not trying or because they're not interested. It's because the instruction is so far above where their learning level is. It'd be like if I were to teach a group of second graders linear algebra. They're not going to learn anything from that because it's not at the right level. Like they're not prepared. They don't have the foundations necessary. So if you have a child who's progressed to grade 6 and never learned basic literacy, they're not able to read their textbook. They're not able to read what's on the chalkboard. It's really not their fault. And then maybe the last thing I'll add on that is that the other thing that we see from that is that that's also a big contributor to dropout. So a lot of children that drop out, they're dropping out because they know they're not getting anything out of school and they have better opportunities outside of school. And so I really think a big part of how to get more children completing primary school and get more children, we would love to see all children progress through secondary school as well. A big component of that is actually going to be to improve learning, because these kids know that they're not learning anything. They know that the instruction's over their head and they see other opportunities outside. But I really think if they knew they were learning, they were getting a lot out of school, they'd be much less likely to drop out as well.
Thank you, Michelle. One last question. I was just wondering, actually, two twin questions, if you could take them. First is, I do understand some work is being undertaken in Indian context. What do you think is the biggest challenge that one can face when one moves towards this foundational learning, going back to where thinking of remedial teaching and learning? And the question number 2 is, if you were to put it in a sort of like in a sequence, some steps. So how do we go about it? So what do you think? What is your idea of how could we go about it in terms of some sequence, some steps? Over to you.
Yeah. I think those two are related, right? The biggest challenge and then how to go about it, because they kind of meet up. I would say there's two directions, right, that relate to both of those questions. And the first is kind of from the top. So at the government level, at the national or at the regional level. But one of the challenges is just to ensure and kind of solidify that commitment to catch up there, right? So it's that commitment, and that's what we talked about, a little while ago, like that dedication, the true commitment, the willingness to do what it takes, the willingness to kind of take this on as a big task and say, we're going to commit to it, we're going to do what it takes to change it. So one, I would say that's a challenge, but that's also a really important kind of early step, right, is to build in the sequencing that commitment. And then the other would be from the bottom. So it's kind of both sides of it. So that's kind of the political economy and the political commitment and leadership commitment. And then on the other side of it is the implementation, and at the classroom level and things like that. And so that is, again, the challenge, but also the sequencing of thinking through these details, of thinking through how are we going to train teachers on this? Who in the system can we get to fill this coaching role? Who's best placed to develop some of these materials that can be quickly gotten out to the teachers and in the classrooms, the assessments, maybe some structured instructional guides to help them that are prioritized for foundational learning and things like that. And so sorting out that kind of implementation piece of apologies, of kind of how to get it done and get it done effectively, and just kind of the mobilization that takes across the system. There's a lot of people involved in that, the teachers, obviously the head teachers, the principals of schools, district officials that would be involved in that. And so the mobilization of that, I think those are probably both the challenges, but also the sequencing in terms of the critical pieces that are needed to kind of open the way for some of those changes to come about. But we've seen it work, so it's a challenge, but it has worked and it does work. So I think it's worth pushing for.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for this amazing presentation. Rabea ji, would you like to say a few words also?
Just a huge thanks, and it's such a pleasure to engage with this very important, substantive, simple but powerful framework. So very much hoping that we can continue to engage actually and keep getting the message out, not only to our students, but also to, sort of these communities of practice that are engaging with various stakeholders. It was fantastic to have you here today. Thank you. Thank you, Tayyaba.
Thank you so
Well,
much.
thank you so much. I would say it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the rich discussion. I mean, this was such a great discussion and such great questions coming out. So really enjoyed and appreciate that. And thank you for the opportunity to join you all.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Rabea. Thank you, Ahsan, Alba, Ali, for putting it all together. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Thank you, Michelle. We look forward to talking more about it sometime. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.